Today for our Sunday Moravian Daily Text reading, we are in the Psalms once again. Psalm 51 verse 1 to 12. And just as a little background to this psalm, this is a psalm written by David. David had sinned greatly. He had committed adultery with Bathsheba. He should have been out fighting in the war. Instead, he's in the palace and he sees Bathsheba bathing. He invites her into his room and sleeps with her, commits adultery. He then sends her husband into the thick of battle to engineer his death. And Nathan the prophet, God speaks to him about this, and Nathan confronts David. And this psalm is David's very public, very vulnerable song of repentance, of asking God for forgiveness and restored relationship. And one of the things when I read this today that really stood out to me was just how David knew. David was confident that God could forgive him for such great sin. He knew that God could wash him clean and he would be clean. He knew that God could cleanse him and forgive him and make him as white as snow. He knew that. And so he approached God. And I just wonder today, do you know that? As a follower of Jesus, are you that confident that it's a great delight to you to bring your sin before the Lord, to say, God, these are the things that I've done, thought, words and deeds. These are the things I haven't done. I acknowledge it as sin, but I bring it before you because I know that you forgive sinners, and you can forgive someone like me, and you can cleanse me from that sin. And that's what's happening in this passage. In this passage, I think we see two very significant consequences of sin. For David, the first consequence of his sin is that he lost a sense of joy. And I do think that in the sin of the world, that brings about upon people this deep, gnawing, hard to explain sadness upon people. And that's what David was experiencing here, and you've probably experienced that. Sin blocks joy in our lives because it blocks us from the source of joy, from God. And that's the second consequence, really, that David acknowledges, that he has been separated from God's presence. Now, that's true globally and completely in the sense that sin separates us from God. We see that in the garden, Genesis 3, Adam and Eve sin, and they hide from God. And God expels them from the Garden of Eden, from that place of continuous, unbroken presence. Sin separates us. And so as David cries out to God, as David confesses his sin to God, as David invites God's cleansing upon him, David's joy is restored, and David's sense of God's presence is restored. And so can I encourage you today, wherever you are, whatever you've done, bring it before the Lord. Give it to him. Confess it before him and confidently receive his forgiveness. He has washed you as white as snow. And for those things in the past that keep popping up and we keep being reminded of those things that we did, make your confession that it is dead. It's in the past. It's forgotten by God. One final thought for you today. I was a little disappointed with the Moravian separation that finished on verse 12, because for me, this psalm, verse 12 into verse 13, just an incredibly significant psalm for me. It's the psalm and the two verses where I first felt the Lord speaking to me about the idea of a reflex. And if you've heard me preach, if you've heard any of these teachings, I use that word all the time. The natural process of a reflex. If I poke you in the eye, you will blink. It's input and outcome. It's a stimulus. And so much of the Christian life that we strive for, that we try really hard for, things like giving and generosity, things like loving others, things like holiness, things like our witness, these things are not the aim, they're not the input, they are the natural reflex outcome to the right kind of stimulus. get the stimulus right, and you will naturally reflex with loving others, with generosity, with holiness, and with witness, with evangelism. So look at verse 12. David says, "Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me." Verse 13, "Then I will teach transgressors your ways. Then sinners will turn back to you." And verse 13 is all about our witness, how we call those in sin into relationship with Jesus, into repentance. And the thing is, when your joy is restored, when salvation joy is bubbling up within you, when you're gospeling yourself, when you're reminding yourself of the good news of Jesus and the cross and his death for you, his blood shed for you for the forgiveness of your sin. No one needs to tell you to tell people about Jesus. It's as natural as blinking when poked in the eye. It's a reflex. So can I encourage you today, bring yourself before the Lord, seek his forgiveness and rejoice in it. Allow the joy of sins forgiven to bubble up within you, and let that reflex into how you engage with those around you this day. Have a wonderful day.